Bonsoir, moi je vous propose...
Good evening. I think we can have a dialogue on the use of certain words, because I think that we particularly like terms like shelters, and we are pushing away words like open, especially when we talk about climate. Those are only the optimal conditions for life on Earth. And if we just focus on climate, we might just offer solutions that might not be the optimal solutions. Now, to begin with, the words that have been retained by the IPCC for their releases for the last 30 years. Well, of course, this was not done on purpose. The idea was not to communicate as worse as possible, but with hindsight, we can really wonder. The IPCC for 30 years communicated on two extremely abstract elements that had nothing to do with our senses and that were saying that the danger would be really later, in hundreds of years from now. As for the average temperature, nobody feels an average temperature. If you want to say something that will not frighten anyone, you talk about average temperature, and the average temperature depends on the daily temperature. It's very dangerous. The temperature is going to go up by 2 degrees. Everybody just laughs at it. We have more than 2 degrees every morning. That's the first difficulty. And then if we add to that the fact that here we're talking about average temperature at the end of the century, well, if you want to mobilize people and want people to do something about this, you can do better. I mean, it was really done in such a way that people would not do anything. And if that was the reason, it was done wonderfully. I mean, we didn't do anything. I mean, that's not really true. Some countries have done a lot. If you look overall between 2009 and 2020, for several reasons, one economic and one for health reasons, the emissions have kept increasing, and they've increased on the year of the Conference of Parties and the year after the Conference of Parties, which is a real problem. And the IPCC, it's a small administrative structure that will invite a certain number of researchers to assess the work of their peers. And as you know, a summary for the decision makers, which is half scientific, half political. But the researchers have done their work. Just to give you an example, in the IPCC report of 2007, they announced that Australia in 2020 would suffer mega floods, huge floods. It's a pity that our friends, climate scientists, did not specifically communicate on these extreme conditions, because that is what will allow us, citizens, to understand what's going to happen to us. And indeed, we see that there's a slight digression in this discourse. But I would like to transmit this anecdote from a top climate scientist. I'm not going to tell you his name unless you invite me privately for a coffee, just to tell you the following. Well, until 2018, my models, well, I had the same relations with them as a baker with his bread. That is, it was something really remote and external. It was my job. When I went home, I would be concerned by other things. And 2018, that's the year from when everybody understood that some strange things were happening. We had some high temperatures. There were significant heat waves. one after the other in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere also. And he said 2018, that's the year from when I looked at my models with a totally different eye. Even for climate scientists, the relationship with this experience, what he can feel, that is also something that's very important. I'm going to use another word now, the word of Anthropocene. I'm just working on the words. Philosophers have nothing more to do. I'm sorry about that. But the word Anthropocene, well, here it's the same thing. Earlier on, we heard the Plantocene or Plantanocene. The chronology is not the same. But plantations have played a very important role in the construction of industrial civilization. The book on Kenneth Promouvoir on all this, the plantations, but the curves surging, that will be in the next century. The word Anthropocene makes it easier to understand the interpretation of Aléas, who is an international geographer, the interpretation of the good Anthropocene. Anthropocene is the period from which humanity will affirm its virility. No more laughing, we are the geographical force. All that is very nice, but that's just the beginning of the story. And now we're beginning to see the rest of the story. We're beginning to understand the effects, the boomeranging effects of the power of our actions on the ecosystems. We are acting within a system locally, but he is reacting overall. And each reaction will be followed by another reaction. So it is a crazy race. And this is a body that's much more powerful than us, and not to mention the limitations to our knowledge. And we've talked about Anthropocene. We have interpreted it according to which our techniques will allow us to come through. And when we believe that these techniques will not allow us to come through on Earth, then you know the rest. We are convinced that we will come through on Mars. Well, I like to make a small digression because I can't stop doing that. But it's strange to believe that if we are not capable of maintaining life on Earth, we're going to create it on a dead planet. I mean, it's a strange logic, isn't it? Very specious. And a trip to Mars in the best conditions, it will take 7 months. 7 months in a small capsule with no gravity. And when you arrive, part of your muscles, your heart will not be in its best condition, and you'll be on your own, and you will have to wear a 30-kilo combination when you have no more muscles, and that's not easy. So let's imagine that we can transform Mars into Earth. We will need 1 billion years. And the sports car sent by Elon Musk to Mars will be out of fashion. But once you've finished this work of doing this, you have to start again, because the mass of Mars is not like the terrestrial atmosphere. So you see, this is delirium supported by the media, by certain authorities, when humanity is in a very dire strait. This is probably not the best thing to tell people that will be able to go to Mars. Already, people believe that the Earth is flat. Others believe that if they can't marry, it's because women are wicked. So the mental state of humanity is not in its top form. And we won't be able to improve that with this type of crazy ideas. And today, a lot of experts in social sciences say that we have started a declaratory type of adventure. That is, since we've done we've hardly done anything, or we haven't done enough, if I may say so. We haven't done enough to stop the emission machine each year going by, forces us into promises, into declarations, to do the opposite. The less we can act on the climate, the more we promise that we're going to be efficient. You have the same rationale that consists in hiding, masking things. We're going to continue our adventure on words, and let's be interested in the word crisis. We usually tell people we're going through an environmental crisis, and sometimes we specify and we say, well, we're going through a climate crisis. Unfortunately, there is no environmental crisis which is not a climate crisis. I'm not climate sceptic, I'd like to reassure you. What do I mean by that? Well, it's the same exercise. The term crisis is absolutely inadequate. A crisis, considering the referential, that's the immediate story of societies, it's a short moment. You come out of a certain standard, there is a disturbance, and you come up with a second normality or standard. And what we hear, what we mean by that, okay, we're not going to have fun, but this is going to lead to another normal time period. Well, it's not really true for COVID, but for climate, this type of discourse, and for ecology in general, this type of discourse has no meaning. During the first decade of this century, we understood that finally the game of stocks was not really the theoretical duration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We thought it would be 1 century, 1.5 centuries. We've gone through some bad conditions, and then we'll go back to normal after these disturbances that were difficult to bear. No, absolutely not. In 10,000 years, according to quite a number of studies that are relatively true now, we might have 35% more emissions that we'll be sending into the atmosphere. The temperature will stabilize maybe at the end of the century or at the beginning of next century, and this will last for millennia. The effects in terms of the melting of the ice will be irreversible for millennia. The seas will rise for millennia. So we're not going to go to a new normality. We'll be falling into a state that we've never heard of on Earth. So we're closing the Holocene, the period that lasted 1,100, 700 years, if we stop at 1950, which was favorable to the birth of human civilization with the development of farming. We're closing that period of time. But we do not know exactly in which direction we're going, especially since climate is interacting with biodiversity, and we will deal with all that with the pressures on resources. Of course, we're growing crops, but there is abiotic resources too, and we're entering a period, and we cannot describe the term. We know about some parameters, but we don't know all the parameters. And there are some phenomena that we're discovering quite recently. So what I find most frightening, and this refers to what I was trying to explain earlier on, that is the habitability of the Earth. That's this phenomena of humid heat. The first article I read on humid heat, that was an article published in 2014. And since then, they multiplied humid heat. That means that if you have a temperature of 35 or 36 degrees, but a very high rate of humidity, the mechanism through which you will regulate your internal body temperature, that is perspiration, this cannot work. Heat accumulates, and in a few hours, you can die if you do not have certain time spent in fresher areas. And this regularly, this phenomenon of humid heat, we we're starting to understand what this means for us human beings. There is some work on other species apart from human beings. I was discussing this. I was discussing the plant systems, and of course, in tropical areas, well, there are no seasons, so there it could become chronic. In literature, we didn't expect to experiment this type of phenomena until the second half of the century, and it happened in one area in Pakistan and in another area in the Persian Gulf. So, of course, we're going very fast. You know, when we talk about average temperature, it's difficult to talk about average temperature when there is an acceleration, when there's an increase in the temperature. What is more interesting is to see when we can have years with an average temperature which will be greater than 1.5 degrees compared to the first part of the 19th century, and then years with a average temperature 2 degrees above, once again, the average temperature in the first half of the 19th century. And that is much earlier. The Met Office said that we would have 1.5 degrees before 2025. And from 2030 onwards, there could be years with more than 2 degrees, with these extreme phenomena proportionately. So the consequences are absolutely huge. And when we talk about crisis, it is a type of denial. It is a way of not understanding what's going to happen to us. And that is very serious. All these words have a weight on the opinion, and this is very important. I'd like to go back to this notion of risk. It is a way of reducing our problems. And we must remember that there are two conditions when you use the term risk. You need a society of individuals, and you need damages that do not concern the whole society, but groups, and the smaller the groups, the narrower they are, well, the more adequate they are. And the second condition, these damages must be offset. Money has to become a kind of universal equivalent. So it's only in this modern society that this notion of risk can develop. And the risk is really a notion which is consubstantially modern. And we are leaving this modern era. In the traditional society, there are no risks. And that's simply because of solidarity, because the group comes first. The individual, the property is not individual. It belongs to everybody. When the mechanisms that look like an insurance, the dime, for example, allowed us to reserve wheat so that it can feed the population in case of famine. So there was a solidarity mechanism, which was a collective mechanism. And this has meaning only in a society where the individual doesn't come first. But in a society where the individual comes first, in a society where we will develop economic activities, where individuals will take greater risks, that will work only if you have an insurance system so that these individuals might deploy their talents, their activities, and produce more wealth. And you know, in France, for example, if there's going to be a war, the insurance system will stop. As soon as the damages become systemic, there is no insurance system possible. And we have to offset that. Now, just imagine, it's not totally absurd. Just imagine that we have difficulties This year is the first time we are having a shortage of hard wheat. All that is happening is not just a problem of hazard. We're going to have a shortage of durum. And so the changes are continuing. There's a concentration of certain gases in the atmosphere. It is a persistent phenomenon, and it can lead to hazards. We can have extreme events. We're in a situation that is relatively different. If you have hundreds of millions of individuals who are condemned to famine, it'd be good to give them money, but what's the purpose of that money? It will be useless. And today, we have this type of scenario when we go beyond an increase of temperature of 3 degrees with what I told you earlier on. I have a study. The researcher is a Chinese, and this study demonstrates that if we have between 3.5 and 4 degrees of increase in temperature, 1/3 of the most populated areas of the Earth would become inhabitable. So here you can imagine that the idea of compensation has absolutely no meaning. You cannot offset for the loss of a surface area in terms of habitability. It has no sense. So this is why I'd rather talk about transcendental damage. What we're impacting today, what we're altering today, these are the general conditions that allow this planet to welcome human species and all the other species. So this is something that's totally different. This isn't circumscribed. It isn't what's in your plate, but it's the plate as such, the plate that is changing. So this notion of risk does not allow us to understand that. Actually, it takes you away from understanding that. And that is what's actually happening to us today. That is the reduction of the habitability of this planet. We were talking about the coastline that was being submerged. We were talking about the climate issues, the change in the rainfall. Some regions will become arid. Other regions will have so much rainfall. You've seen the Visé and La Jolla, and those regions might be inhabitable for physical reasons. And to those two reasons, you can add this wet heat, humid heat. And in certain conditions, it can be even worse than in the tropical areas. And to these physical reductions, and for the latter ones, physical, biological ones, you can add the fact that the houses on the planet might rot, the fact that we might have trouble having food. There can be some violent phenomena. You can have the pests, you can have all kinds of diseases. There is this reduction mechanism from the physical point of view of the term, and there is the alteration from the qualitative point of view of the term. So it is an era where the habitability of the planet is really being downgraded. Now, we could act differently, although it is difficult to act. In a small essay that several of us wrote, we wrote as a main measure, because what is destroying the habitability of the Earth, apart from demography in terms of diversity, is the height of the flows of material and energy. So that is the mass of products that we're producing and the mass of infrastructure that we are developing. If we really wanted to take the bull by the horns, we have to make it take another path. And that would be the break. There's no answer to this challenge that would not be a break in time. We need to break because all our interests are going in the opposite direction. And so the measure we were proposing, of course, this is a measure to which nobody can have access. These are quotas, and not only carbon quotas, but generic quotas. That is, quotas based on the environmental footprint of each. Not only the carbon footprint, but the environmental footprint. There are two quotas, a daily quota and a quota over your lifetime, the real estate, aviation, cars, and on your bank cards, you would have a chip for money, and you would have the CO2 footprint. And to reduce these flows, each person would have, over the full year, a quota, a number of environmental footprint quota on the chip. And it would be fun, and it would have meaning only if quotas were the same for everyone. So we have to find other ways of distributing merit other than this material part. And the moon, we're going to go to Mars, so we can skip the moon. So that's the whole problem, and we have a paradox here, because finally, senior people, they are really hung on their ideas and their ways of living. And the youth is desperate. I don't know if you saw, and you could read it in Le Monde. There was a study in the Lancet on the young people in the world. They interviewed 10,000 young people in some tens of countries: Brazil, Philippines, Nigeria, India. So it's not a study just for the Western youth. And I think 39% of these young people, 3/4 say that they are frightened about their future. And 39% are wondering about whether they want to have children in the future or not. And almost 50% are worried about the disappearing of humanity. So you can imagine. And what is really surprising, because this does not correspond to what we are taught in terms of the climate. It all depends on your level of education. And here, in terms of the fear on the future of the Earth, these 10,000 people interviewed in 10 countries, this is quite a wide sample, therefore, with different levels of studies, different countries. That's 3/4 of the people questioned. So we have a kind of abyss created between this youth that is desperate and adults. And here it is the teacher talking to you, adults who either remain silent or are idle. But ladies and gentlemen, what we need to stop doing. So that's the current situation. And I don't think that there's any possible analogy of that in the whole history of humanity.
And the great difficulty today is that this is a very fast phenomenon. Since the end of the 70s until today, average temperature rose more or less by 1 degree in 4 decades. 4 decades. By the way, sometimes when you go from glaciary era to interglaciary era or ice age, the degree varies by 1 degree every millennium. If you go from ice age to another ice age. But people in the past didn't have any knowledge of the phenomenon. It was so slow, whereas what happens to us is very, very quick. So let's be careful about the words we use. They convey something. When you choose your words poorly, if you're not careful enough, these will convey ideas of a denial, which, and I suppose you'll agree with me, is not going to facilitate change. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you ever so much. If you don't mind, please stay with us. Stay with us. And with Chris, we're going to have now perhaps a Q&A rather than having a summary report, or at least we'll try and answer questions from the audience. Well, back to work, as Céline Baudard would say, and I think she's in a room. It's a never-ending thing. So we're going to conclude together. A conclusion is some type of opening. And so what I'd like to get is reactions to Dominique Bour's speech and to the other lectures, I think, because the thing is to reuse these words. Sometimes we fumble our way through the vocabulary because we're overwhelmed. We talk about the crisis, and yeah, the crisis, that's true. That's something which is outdated already. We know how to use the word, but the question of risks or hazards, threats, urgency, these three words don't necessarily describe the risks or the threat, but the sense of urgency. That's my first question. And what about the word urgency? Do you think that to some extent it could be the proper word? But we seem to lose the proper words because, you know, what matters to me is not just the easy things, but these concepts seem to shake. Well, we talked at this at lunchtime. The first reason is that if we don't want to be exposed to 2 degrees, what we would need to do on a global scale is to decrease by more than half our emissions before the end of this decade. That is 7% decrease annually. We've managed thanks to COVID, but as you probably know, it's going to be the same as in 2010 when we managed to catch up what we'd not done in 2009 due to the subprime crisis, and the same will happen in 2021. We'll manage to catch up in terms of decreasing carbon CO2 emissions and CO2 emissions due to COVID. So that's the first reason. And these 2 degrees, that's very important, the 2-degree threshold, is that this is a plateau, a threshold, above which we've had we shouldn't go beyond that level. Otherwise, all the species on Earth couldn't adapt. This is the maximum, the ceiling, if you will. And the second reason, if you have 2 degrees, you can adapt as a species. But as you know, the higher the temperature, the more energy accumulates, and the more the destructive power. And the third reason is the more you exceed this threshold, the 2-degree threshold, the more likely or the more possible is a phenomenon of a snowball effect. That is, then we would be like in a stove, and this would be totally discorrelated from the CO2 emissions. We couldn't come back to an anterior status quo. That's the first set of reasons. The first reasons why we could call that an urgency, that's true. And the second type of reasoning, which justifies this sense of urgency, and we're trying this, is that the less you act, the less likely you'll be able to stabilize temperature. We're talking about 1.5 degrees, okay, but that's very ambiguous or ambivalent because there's a difference between years and averages and means, and it would require such an effort that nobody's going to be able to do this. And to meet the target, we should have started, let's say, 1 or 2 years ago to take drastic measures. In as much as you can see everywhere on Earth, nobody's taken such decisions. So the more we procrastinate, the more difficult it is for us to stabilize temperature on Earth, the higher the threshold is. And also, the greater the effort, almost an inaccessible effort. So what I'm saying about the climate really is a trap. There's a trap there. We're stuck. We are in a situation which is considerably difficult. If we don't act, Well, we know it's going to come. And acting, therefore, we think is year in, year out, more and more difficult, almost impossible. That maybe this is continual change. Maybe it's going to last 100 years, 200 years. So then, rather than having here and there interventions close to the riverbeds or where the risks are, let's say, wouldn't you say that it would be, well, I'll be perhaps a bit radical, a radical proposition, but couldn't we perhaps think about the grand scale for human beings? We would need to compute all of this and to know where we could possibly live. If 1/3 of the places on Earth are places where people will not be able to live in, maybe there will be other places that will be open to human settlements rather than spending our money and energy to try and protect and keep what we have. And this echoes what was said this morning about Noah's Ark. We could perhaps find other places, essential places, the ones we want to keep, and then to build this ark and to move to these places. We've always been nomadic peoples, let's not forget that. We've always been roaming the earth. So don't you think that the time has come for us to move in masses and then forget these towns rather than fighting for these harbor-like cities and spend through the nose so that to protect these cities because they're vulnerable, we could perhaps take refuge on the mountaintops, which is what nomadic peoples would do for 100 or 200 years. We are a fragile species, and then we could take some distance and look at nature and how it's changing. And I don't know. I was just thinking. I know it's a bit of a radical viewpoint. Well, but it's been yonks. We've been living in the same place for years, and we're almost 8 billion on Earth. And the land that we inhabit is politically inhabited everywhere. Well, the good thing is that even if you look at the worst-case scenario, it'll take decades to happen. But recently, the World Bank Group produced a document on possible immigration with a figure of 250 million. They only factored in, I think, let me see, they factored in only the people who would move from the coast, away from the coast, not humid heat, etc. So the figure doesn't mean much. But think about this, as we saw before. Look at the political turmoil created by migrations, flows of migrants that we described earlier on. This was ridiculous in terms of the number of people to welcome. Well, 1 million all in all, but otherwise thousands of people, that's all. But then we're looking at a different order of things. And I've not read anything that would look at the topic cold-heartedly. And that's frightening. Okay, Noah's Ark. Okay, that's good. But we're talking about human beings in this case. So, frankly, no, we don't even dare and think about these things. It seems like it's unthinkable. And what's difficult and what's happening today is that we can't refer to any moment in time compared to the large floodings that we have an experience of. In this case, the flows would be massive flows, more territories would be occupied, that would require infrastructure and the rest. It's something that's almost unthinkable. If you know any example, please tell me. I know no report, no study that's looking at this coldly and that's trying to look forward and to look at the possibilities that might appear during the second half of the century of constant flows of migrants, large flows of migrants during decades and decades. I've never seen anything on that. No book, study or report that faces this. because we're cowards. And sorry, but I've taken in so much in 30 years that I'm not going to do this. Don't count on me. Xavier. Well, thank you very much for this active concern that you're sharing with us. But you've talked about reducing the production of products and infrastructure because this is connected to the notion of architecture. Most of us are architects here at the Cité de l'Architecture, and we know that we were on the side of production, the production of infrastructure. That's our bread and butter. And this is how the orders we get from the authorities follows the requirements of our cities. And after listening to all these exchanges, I'd say that architecture is defined and reinvented and revisited each time we have a historic period. We think about what could be good for some type of tomorrow. It's a theoretical discourse, which is some type of projections, because then it ends into a number of projects. We're forward-looking. We're forward-looking into the field of theory. And I contend that maybe we have another horizon, which is perhaps to come to a stop and to think about something else, which is not to build. We, as a generation, should perhaps think that there's another horizon of expectations from architects, which is not on the side of construction, which is perhaps reparation or to lower the ecological burden or to alleviate the burden. And usually what we tend to think is to protect buildings for the buildings to remain stable. But what is not stable is the ecosystems, and we can't do this on our own. We don't have the skills to produce buildings or built environments. We've seen this. It's always an alliance with the landscape planners. They've given us the skills about the living so that we develop on the basis of the environment, and with the ecologists as well. So it's probably with these other friends of ours who invent differently that we have to change the message that will hive out to society and societies. It is not because we're going to have nice green projects that we're going to go ahead and continue. No, no, no. We have a responsibility, which is to repair ecosystems. And I think we saw that before. There are many architectural nuggets to be found and invented, and at different places, in different environments. Because if there's a flood, if there's something that's shaken, then we know that we have to repair. Well, there's three things I'd like to say to react to that. Number one, I'm on the scientific board for a project in Luxembourg, the Duchy of Luxembourg, at the behest of Claude Turmestre, who's the Minister of Planning, called Luxembourg en Transition. And there are three teams still in the race. And, well, at the center, it's architects and town planners, but they work with ecologists and the forest managers, etc., and Carbon Cat. What they're doing is incredible. And the output is incredible. And that's true. There's this meshing that exists between town planning and the ecosystems. And the three projects I'm thinking about, these projects that are being hatched, are things we'll be working on. And they're very interesting. And they focus on the ecosystems, but also town and city planning. It is interesting. If you will, they're recasting the whole thing. I don't know how those from Luxembourg will say, but seeing what I've seen, perhaps people will not be that enthusiastic about it. But anyways, as an attempt to redesign a future, I think it is quite interesting and makes sense. My second point is that, okay, restoring ecosystems is essential, but the prerequisite is that in the decades to come, if we really want to act and do something in the decades to come, we should have an impact on the planet, or a footprint that would be 0.8 planets or globes. And if you look at international papers, if you look at Costa Rica or other countries such as Sri Lanka, we can more or less meet the fundamental needs on the basis of UN standards, and, well, the way they understand well-being is to be challenged. But anyway, this is a source of hope, you see, because I'm almost certain that we could live better, a living that would make more sense, that would be healthy and socially much better balanced if we had this type of footprint, 0.8, rather than in the US, which is 5 times the planet. Keyes, Angus Deaton, read their books. He was a neoliberalist. Look at those who die out of despair. Michael Sandel as well's book on the market aristocracy. And it's a kind of craziness. We saw that with those who elected Trump. And we're destroying the planet now because we're destroying all that's surrounding us. And I'm almost certain that if we were reasonable enough and virtuous, I know this is totally impossible, then we would manage to rebuild societies that would be much more harmonious, you see. And that's my second point. And the third point, which I think is very important, and that's like breaking away from things. And the first one who saw that is a neoclassic economist, usually not my friends, but he's really good. Pierre Noël Giraud, that's his name. He had written in the 90s L'inégalité du monde, and he told us what would happen to us. And then several years ago, he produced a book. He wrote a book called L'homme inutile, the useless man, a splendid book. There's a whole chapter on ecology. I'm totally against that. But anyway, who cares about this? The substance of the book is very interesting. And he was saying, you know, now it's the longer time. We know that population is going to decrease with no environmental problems. Even though what I told you might be wrong, then population on Earth is going to decrease. Now, look at what happened in the past centuries. This is a total breakaway. It's a turning point, and this is going to have a major impact on your business and job and the way you look at things. All this to say that this is true. We're going through a number of difficulties that are huge, but then if you look at today's societies, there are some nuggets. If you put them together, you would have the necklace of a new civilization. Times are tough. So tough that I could think about killing myself, but I'm not going to do this because I have this passion, and this gives meaning, and that's the message, the take-home message for the youth, rather than saying you should be de-radicalized, but don't despair is the message. There's no need to despair. There's a lot of things we can do. For instance, if you think about agroecology or permaculture, for instance, there's a book I published in Mathieu Calam called, well, so far we've had 4 types of societies, agrarian communities, merchant cities, industrial cities. And for each type of society, there's always been a specific type of farming. And today we have new agriculture, but we don't have society for this new type of farming. So that's why it's not developing fast. If you add also what we do with nature and also the perma-circular economy, economy with a mission, that's quite interesting. Or if you look at the arts or the law, the promotion of natural rights and non-anthropocentric morale. If you put all those nuggets in a necklace, you will have a new society. Well, this is an interesting question. And I think, why should we use the word restoration rather than regeneration? Because restoring is like you're going to go back in time to a previous condition. It's impossible. I'm always a bit surprised about the words reversibility, restoration. Maybe regeneration, yeah, that's a rebirth. And it means that this is what the symposium is all about. That is risks, threats, and urgency is the idea of regeneration, a rebirth, a renaissance. It's not just to take again the same things, to do the same, but it's to accept being reborn to new living conditions, to avoid war between human beings. Because in all that's written, well, we didn't have lots of dystopias during these 2 days, but there are many. If you think about not really the Noah's Ark to save humankind, but wars between human beings, because we know that forever human beings are organized so that some would exploit the majority of people. So the climate crisis and the climate urgency are things that require great political awareness. I think that, you know, since we've talked about bio-narratives, and that's very important. I think that all these narratives that try and link up a thinking that would be a cosmos type of idea, that is to have a common world, with a policy that is reality, well, it's difficult to have human beings that agree with each other. That's something fundamental.
And architecture has a role to play, because beyond building, or maybe not building, as Xavier Bonneau just said, we have to have hypotheses, possibilities that will not be realized, but that will lead human beings to discuss amongst each other, to opt for this or that track. Imagine possibilities, because we cannot just stick to scientific data. All the scientists, expertise means the publication of counter-expertise. There are texts coming out that say the opposite of other texts. So we have to create a generalized defiance and think that we can save ourselves by creating communities in certain areas, thinking that, otherwise we won't be able to get along. So we need to explore that. Well, I just feel like giving you an example which goes totally in your direction. A company in which I'm working, where they want to set up a farming university. And this farming university, it's the Sainte-Mare de Philippe Desbrosses farm. We're doing that with the University of Tours. And in November, the city of Tours and the region of Tours, Centre-Val de Loire, it's a very ambitious idea. They want to create a school where they will have a new civilization based on agriculture. So there will be training in agronomy, and this school exists since 1995. They deal with permaculture, etc. And here we will have farming, we'll have breeding, and we will build a program for intellectuals, farmers and philosophers. You know, there was this order that existed in the Île-de-France region, the Saint-Victor. And the Greeks would have jumped up into the ceiling. It's the farmer-philosopher. And these farmers have masters or doctors. They were engineers, lawyers in the past, and they want to go back to Earth, or go to Earth and work on the Earth. So we give them a training in philosophy and anthropology, and we try to avoid certain traps. Farmer is nice, but farmer is the Neolithic revolution. A minority of human beings dominate the majority. One gender dominates the other. So that's not desired. And so therefore, we make them go through all that, understand what happened with the Neolithic revolution, the relations between people. So we go through all this, and we lead them to think about all this. And then they are players amongst others. And we want to give them weapons, munitions. I mean, we don't want them to fight, but we want to give them food for thought to build something else. Builders of a new civilization. That's beautiful, an ambitious program.
Est-ce qu'il est envisageable que la régulation
Can we believe that this regulation can take place in a liberal way? Or do you believe, and that is what you suggested earlier on, do you believe that we should plan for authoritarian solutions? I'll just mention one, because we're here in Paris. We have a lady mayor. I really like her, and she's very authoritarian, and she tells the motorists to drive at 30 kilometers an hour, etc. So, solutions outside of this university that you mentioned, do you think we can have liberal solutions, or do you think we need authoritarian solutions? Or Will they have to be authoritarian by necessity? I'll try to answer very briefly. Well, what I'm proposing, I did not develop, but what we're proposing in this book is not authoritarian. We're saying it very clearly. It wouldn't be constitutional, but we need to have a referendum. I'm half Swiss, half French. I live in a country where there are rotations. There's one every 2 months. And we would need something like that. That is, for it to work, it has to be accepted first. If it is not accepted, if it is imposed from the outside, if we don't understand it, it will never work. It's a lost cause, because today you have a fragmentation of the information landscape with the population in various niches and an explosion of plots. I mean, if somebody proposes what I'm proposing for in a referendum, you would receive some 48%. But in Switzerland, there was something like that. There was only 40%. But there was a vote close to that idea, and it received 35% of votes in favor in a country which is not poor. So we might come up with an authoritarian regime. That means people who are unscrupulous, who don't have much ethics, and who want everything for themselves and impose things to the others. But for us, it isn't that. For us, we weren't concerned by the conditions of acceptance of such solutions. But to do this in an authoritarian way would denature things. So no, we'll see what will happen, but that's not something that can pass through in an authoritarian way. And as for the human nature, there is a human condition. Nature, that's difficult. You have historical events, and you feel that individuals are not the same. After the religious wars, you have this in the philosophy of the contract, and the only possible horizon is the satisfaction to satisfy your needs here on Earth. Whereas in the prior civilizations, salvation was important. And if we are beginning to have some very interesting studies, and the societies before the Neolithic, there could be slavery, there could be different hierarchies, but the model, according to the studies we have carried out, what seems to impose to our imagination is that you have societies that had types of organizations that would change in the year. With the moment when we would all get together, it would be hierarchical, and then the rest of the year would be very flat. So there's not a human nature that is totally closed. And according to the historical conditions in which it is deployed, it's like our talents. If you were born among the aléas and you have the genes of Mozart, you'll be incredible polyphonist, but you will not compose così fan tutte. So you cannot imagine that the liberal individual that we've produced, the liberal economic system, it's more complicated. Both do not really converge. But we've produced a selfish individual, cold, calculative. And so that is the individual we have produced. And dear friends, there's better, and there was better in history. Any more reactions before we close and we meet around a drink? Maybe some 2 or 3 more reactions? Can you please introduce yourself before you put your question? My name is Hugo. I'm not an architect. I'm a developer, or rather an engineer, scientific engineer. And I'll just thank you for your speech. I found it very interesting. And you're talking to a public that is already in favor of what all you're saying. As we said earlier on, there's a genuine problem. And you're saying we're not doing much, and you're giving us ideas, such as having an energy credit. This is what we tried to do 3 years ago with the carbon tax. Now the question is how to get such a measure accepted socially. Can it be applied in an absolute way? Is it equal for all social classes? And people living far from their homes, who are poorer, well, what would happen to them if we had such measures? Knowing that the carbon tax is a measure that is recommended by the greatest economists in the world. So it's probably something very positive. Well, yes, the carbon tax and all the economists, we've seen it in France, is very difficult. In Sweden it works, it does work. In countries such as France, where there's a lot of inequalities, you've seen the reactions of the yellow jackets. The low cost of energy has allowed people to go and live far from the place where they're employed. And without forms of support, this is not possible. It's very difficult. You know, a carbon tax and a quota. Carbon tax is based on your purchasing power, so it is very unfair when you have a low purchasing power. And that is why if you live far away from your home and you have a home that is not properly insulated and a car that uses a lot of petrol, I mean, everything has to be equal. Otherwise, what can we do for the flows of material and energy? But that does not exclude the fact that there are support mechanisms. In the environment, something works only if it is accompanied. Waste treatment, waste processing, that's how it works. And be careful, it's not just carbon, it is ecological unit. You take into account biodiversity and resources, and we know how to do that. The federal office has a method to calculate your carbon footprint for various goods, and we should do this for all. We have a certain number of examples, but it wouldn't be that difficult. So you're right, there is no acceptance for this, and we're in between. We don't know what's going to happen. Very naively, I thought that when it would be a sensitive issue, the number of people mobilizing on all this would be greater. This is not what happened, but it's not also exactly the opposite, especially in France. We have this figure of 55% of the population that believes that we will not escape sobriety. And one of the best surveys is the survey from Le Bosco. And it doesn't percolate in the changes in our own ways of living or from the point of view of elections. So we're in a strange situation, and if we had communication that would measure up with the challenges, if the authorities would do that, which they're not doing, maybe we would have a change in the population. For the moment, there are a lot of contradictions. People hear that there is a threat with the climate, and everything else tells them the opposite. And it is not easy. Each one has his problems, his own difficulties, and it is not surprising that we don't have more people accepting to go towards something else. Communication on all these topics is very weak. And when it exists, it is momentaneous, and it is immediately contradicted by all the external flows. What you've put forth are the paradoxes in the use of words, in the references, the paradoxes in the way in which we envisage the possibilities. So it is something that has marked us in these 2 days. And what you said, considering the surveys, Dominique, you told us about the surveys on the youth and the not so young, and this depression is intergenerational. And we will verify that increasingly in the future, this depression, all that is happening that we cannot name, this loss of hope in a way. Of course, it's affecting the young people because they have more years to live. And what is shared by everyone is Well, and that's why we've organized the symposium, is because we think that there are things we need to think about together. And I'd rather talk about the coupling between architecture and philosophy. And so therefore we have this idea on how, in a speculative way, how we can imagine all this. This was really present these 2 days. The importance of imagining possibilities is not a formula. If we look at the different conferences, which were all very stimulating, they show knowledge, new ways of seeing science, that is, knowledge in habitated areas. But at the same time, all that was around, imagining, risk-taking, and risk that is not running risk, but this concept of risk as such. So I think that is extremely important. And in architecture, we've observed since some time, and we've seen this, whether it's in the Venice Biennale or the Global Awards or in other areas, we see a lot of proof that there are a lot of ways of doing things. There's a multiplicity in the ways of doing things in architecture, in landscaping, in building territories. And what is important is this diversity, so that we can face these climate, biodiversity emergencies. This question on these paradoxes and the importance, I mean, I'd really like to thank Dominique to stress the question on language and the words. And Thorsten was talking about translation, all that will allow us to go from one world to another, from one discipline to another, from one era to another. This is essential because among these couplings between architecture and philosophy, the question regarding language, the words we use, our language, how we can communicate with each other, tell our stories, all that is very important. I know, I really like Ricoeur. He says that there are times that call for utopia. He said in his book on utopia. And I really like this idea. It's he's lauding creative imagination, but the word utopia is also a problem because it's as if there wasn't any place. But we're putting Earth, Gaia, the planet Earth with an E in capital. But there's also the places, the relations between things, those that are beneficial. And I've observed, we didn't talk much about this, but among the major concepts between architects and philosophers, we have to find harmony, symbiosis, synergies. And it has to take form.